Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for that. So welcome, everyone. Today, we have an exciting presentation for everyone. My name is Natasha Chi, and I'm the principal at the law offices of Natasha S. Chi, and I specialize in entertainment and IP law. I'm on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and I was really interested in having a program on intersectionality this year. So I'm so excited to present to you Sherry Diamond. She is the CEO and General Counsel for the Santa Clara County Bar Association. She has an amazing career spanning more than 35 years in the nonprofit sector, including roles as CEO, Executive Director, and Executive Director since 2003. Following a long and successful career as a registered drama therapist, she was a graduate school professor in Montreal, Quebec. Bonjour, and the faculty in the Faculty of Fine Arts, the Department of Creative Arts Therapies, and the Department of Creative Arts Therapies. She ultimately pursued her JD rather than a PhD in order to become a stronger advocate. She graduated with distinction in 2007 from Pacific Coast University School of Law in Long Beach, California, where she eventually became Dean of Academic Standards. She relocated to San Jose in August 2019 to join the SCCBA as CEO and General Counsel. Sherry practices nonprofit law and has served on several international, national, and local boards of directors, including the Long Beach Bar Association Board of Governors. She is a theater artist, a writer, a lover of cooking and wine, and a fearless traveler. She has a grandson, Nathan, who is the billion stars that light her way. So sweet. So today, Sherry will share her personal experiences as a biracial, bisexual, bicultural woman with multiple professional identities, in addition to her personal identities. We will discover how these intersections inform our relationship to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as our privilege and our sense of belonging. We will also develop a deeper understanding of what it really means to be an ally. So allow me to introduce Sherry and have her take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you. This is the kind of work I've been doing my entire life, and I was pleased to be invited to share some of my life experience, both professionally and personally, with respect to intersectionality. So I thank you in advance for indulging me. So I'll just share my screen so that we can get started. As Natasha said, I'd like to talk a little bit today about multiple role identities for intersectional lives, because I'm not the only one who lives an intersectional life. Each of us does, really, in so many capacities, so many ways. So again, as a theater artist and a writer, words are my business, and as a lawyer, words are the tools with which we practice our trade. And I'm really interested in understanding what they mean so that when we do use them, we use them with intention. And it helps us all make sure we're on the same page. So I want to share the perspective and the lens through which I'll be talking with you today. So the word intersect means, of course, to pierce by passing through or across. And simply, very simply, intersectionality posits that our lives just cannot be explained by single categories, such as gender, race, or sexual orientation. Intersectionality theory, first articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, is best understood as overlapping and interrelated rather than isolated and distinct. Intersectionality theory refers to the very complicated and cumulative way that the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized persons or groups. So the intersection of the categories, paradoxically, can produce experiences of both privilege and oppression contemporaneously. So let's break that down a little bit. And before we talk about or come to a deeper understanding of how privilege and oppression work together, let's understand what privilege really means. This is the definition I use in my work, a definition I've been working with for decades. When I was a professor, I taught all the ethics courses, including cross-cultural issues in counseling. And I read Peggy McIntosh's essay, White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through women's studies. You'll all receive, if you haven't already, a copy of Peggy's essay. Peggy McIntosh was on faculty at Wesley, I believe, in Boston in the 80s, working in women's studies. And she had the good fortune to work with a lot of like-minded folk, as you can imagine, including a mostly male faculty, all card-carrying feminists with respect to the women's movement. But Peggy just couldn't get her white male colleagues to understand their privilege, the advantages that they had in society just by virtue of being white and just by virtue of being male. They rejected the notion that they hadn't pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, that they hadn't worked very hard for their doctorates, and they couldn't see how it was that they were benefiting from their whiteness or their maleness, both things that they were born into and hadn't earned. So Peggy defines privilege in this way: an invisible package of unearned assets, which I can count on cashing in every day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious, like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guidebooks, passports, codes, visas, clothes, a compass, emergency gear, blank checks, unearned assets that just by getting up every day and engaging with the world that we're cashing in on and about which we're meant to remain completely oblivious. And that's the tricky part, because once we do become aware of the ways in which we've benefited, that we didn't earn, that we don't deserve necessarily, that we didn't work hard to get, but other people who are not like us are not benefiting from. Once we get to that, once we have that awareness and understanding, it becomes incumbent upon us as the just, equitable, and right thing to do, to find ways to dismantle those structures in our systems that are giving some people that leg up, no questions asked, while forcing other persons to fight for it, to prove who they are, to prove what they're worth, and often to a closed door. In this essay, Peggy, as a personal exercise, wrote down a list, which ultimately became known as Peggy's List, of then 47 things that she cashed in on every day by virtue of her being a white woman. And the list, when you read it, you'll find is today, 40 years later, incredibly relevant, still poignant and stunning, that there are still so many ways in which our skin color or our gender or both, because we can't really divorce ourselves one from the other, are serving to give us an advantage. The list has since been modified, expanded, generalized to other groups of marginalized communities, and where we look at the ways in which the LGBTQIA plus community might experience both privilege and oppression, where in comparison to the heteronormative dominant culture and so forth. I hope you find it as compelling as I do when you peruse Peggy's list. So as we talk about intersectionality, we'll just start with this sort of blank schema. As you heard in my biography, I'm an attorney and I practice nonprofit law. I'm also the CEO of the bar, which is where my two professions intersect and overlap. I've been in the nonprofit sector my entire career. I've never worked for a for-profit organization. I've also been a professor where I taught courses in disciplines in which I practiced. I'm a theater artist, and I also identify as a writer. I publish in an online publication. I'm published academically. And I have a nonprofit theater company in Long Beach, California. You back up. So I have a lot of different professional identities. And I get asked often, why go from being a drama therapist to a lawyer? How did you make that leap? Or a therapist more broadly and an attorney? And how is it you come to be running a bar association when you used to be a professor and indeed still teach from time to time? Again, I couldn't begin to separate those two, my role as an attorney and a nonprofit professional and a clinician, because one's always led to the other and they've overlapped and intersected. And my work as a clinician is very similar to our work as lawyers, because we're always engaging with people in states of crisis. It's crisis intervention, it's crisis management, it's distilling the issues that are being presented and providing guidance and support for a client who's seeking to resolve whatever those presenting issues are. So it's a very similar approach to very different disciplines. With respect to my personal identities, my ethnic identities, as you know, I identify as a woman. That was in my bio. I also identify as a bisexual woman. And that bisexuality gives me some access to a space in the LGBTQIA plus community, sets me squarely central. But my identity as a bisexual person is only visible if I'm in a same-sex relationship. If I'm in a heterosexual relationship, then the presumption will always be that I'm straight. Makes sense. But I can't separate those two. The fact that I might be in a relationship with a man doesn't make me any less a bisexual woman. I'm also Irish on my mother's side, and I'm Black and I'm Jewish on my father's side. So that makes me a biracial or a mixed race person. And that makes people uncomfortable. Bisexuality might make people uncomfortable. As women, sometimes our gender creates obstacles and interferes with how we perform in our workplaces and in our social communities. So we'll come back to some of that as we go on. But first, I want to talk a little bit about diversity, because when we talk about the discomfort that our identities may create in others, we're really talking about diversity. And we use that word a lot. We've been using that word for decades now, and I'm not sure we all have a common understanding of what it means. This, and you may disagree, but this is the premise from which I begin my point of departure, and the definition was coined by Rosalind Taylor O'Neill, who is an American DEI consultant, and she's internationally known. I had the good fortune to meet her several decades ago, and have followed her work. This is from one of her first books called The 7 Keys to Success in Diversity. And she defines diversity in this way: characteristics we have in common are similarities, and those unlike others, differences. And the impact, italics are mine, are our similarities and our differences have on our interactions. The effect that my being like you or not like you has on my ability to be comfortable with you. So when we look at those intersecting identities, and I identify as a biracial woman, someone who's Irish, Black, and Jewish, that might be confusing or unsettling, because it's the human condition, really, to want to pigeonhole somehow or find a place for the person with whom we're engaging and interacting. So our intersectionality is premised in Kimberly Crenshaw's definition, fundamentally in gender, ethnicity, and class, but it's so much more complicated than that, and we'll get there. So again, as you apply this to yourself, you'll understand that you gender identify in a very specific way. It might be as male, as female, as trans, as non-binary. You'll have what you feel is your primary identity. And as intersectionality theory states, we can't separate our gender from who we are ethnically. So again, for me, I'm Irish, I'm Black, and I'm Jewish. And all of those intersect with my womanness. And then there's class. And class is a very curious thing, because it's probably the most malleable of these three. I was very, very poor as a child. My father was killed when I was just about to turn 3 in a car crash. And my mother had me quite young. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So she was uneducated, married at 17, had me at 17, my brother at 18, and she had just turned 20 when she was widowed. So we grew up really impoverished, very few resources. My brother and I were welfare kids. There was rarely food in the fridge. And it was the 1960s, and my mother was wild and fled the place of my birth, Pittsburgh, for Southern California. And I was largely raised by a village of bikers and hippies and felons and junkies and ne'er-do-wells of every sort. I am the first person in my entire family schema, going back many generations, to have finished high school. And to date, I'm still the only one before or since have to have gone to college, where I worked full-time and went to school full-time for both my bachelor's degree and my master's degree, and was a single mom during most of that time, and then went on to law school. So my class, based on my diligence and my intuitive understanding that to better my circumstances, I would have to work hard and I would have to pay for it myself. I started working when I was 14. And my class then changed or morphed. It evolved. And if we had a middle class, I could be regarded as a middle class person. But that's a presentation for another day. So when I present, as I have today, as an attorney specializing in nonprofit law, as the CEO and general counsel for the Santa Clara County Bar Association, one wouldn't expect that my beginnings are very humble and that I have an understanding of hardship in ways that many of my colleagues do not. So our intersectionality then is quite the iceberg, and only bits and pieces are visible to the naked eye, break through that surface. And even then, they're based on assumptions. It's not likely that you would have expected me to say that I was Black and Jewish and Irish. And indeed, I've been told many times that I'm not, or that I can't be by others for whom this creates a state of discomfort. Sorry, I skipped ahead too quick. Beneath the surface lies some other facets of our identities that we'll talk about as we go on, that's not at all visible to the naked eye. So expanding it outward a little bit, then we've talked about our race, which for the record is distinguished from ethnicity in a certain way, meaning that ethnicity is, gosh darn it, there we go. Going the wrong way. Okay. Ethnicity is a physiological, biologically explained phenomenon common to us all, where race is not based in science, but based in a social construct. So race is a socially produced principle. And by definition, race refers to things like skin color, hair, facial features, things that are very, very physical in nature, as opposed to biological. And there's a lot of debate around that. We don't have time to get into whether or not race is a real thing scientifically or not. We continue to use the word race because racism is still a very powerful, very real presence in our lives. But sexual orientation and gender identity, again, not something we can divorce from itself. Our nationality, so where we identify in terms of our citizenship, and disability, and whether or not we identify as having a disability, and whether that disability is visible or not, whether it's physical or psycho-emotional or mental or any other kind of identification with respect to disability. And it's even more complicated than that. So I'd like to tell you a little story Because of the nature of intersectionality and the inclination for us as humans to want to parse out facets of the self. When I was 16, as I am here, and I applied for my driver's license in California, the application at that time asked to select race. And I was given 5 choices: Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or other. So I checked Black, white, and other, and I wrote Jewish in the space where I was asked to specify. I handed the application in to the woman behind the counter, an older white lady who skimmed it and then peered over her reading glasses at me and then handed the application back. And she said, "You have to circle 1. And I said, "1 what?" And she said, "1 race. You have to check 1. And I handed the application back to her and I stepped back and I said, "You decide." Very frustrated, she marked something down and continued to process it. I don't know what she put. I can guess, but I don't care, except that over the course of my life, I've been asked to do that many, many times. When I wanted to go to the high school that I went to, it was outside my district, but they had a couple of programs that interested me. And I had to apply for a special transfer. My high school, the one that I did end up getting into, had not yet met its desegregation quotas under Brown versus Board of Education. So I applied for the transfer based on race. And when I submitted the paperwork, I was told I had to prove it. I had to prove that I was Black and Irish. So I collected my father's birth certificate and presented that, and I was admitted to the high school. We'll talk a little bit about, I hope, and if we walk away from anything from today's presentation, it's that having to prove who you are is, I almost can't find the words. It's disrespectful, it's dehumanizing, it's hurtful, and it's wrong. So I've my whole life always claimed, identified my personhood fully, because how I look to me is not relevant. How I grew up is, and who I really am is. Because to pick one means I have to reject and deny everyone else, people important to me in my family. And just as an aside, I love that this picture I'm wearing black and white. I didn't notice that until this morning and it cracked me up. So that iceberg is complicated and it does make people uncomfortable. We want people to just be one thing. Well, you can't be a theater artist and a lawyer. Why not? Litigators are very theatrical. I'm not a litigator, but it looks fun, and I think I'd enjoy it. So what's not visible? Our culture, right? Culture, and I won't give you more definitions because it makes it feel too much like a lecture, but our culture is something that's handed down from generation to generation. It has to do with language and food and tradition and mores. And we can't always see what someone's culture is. What about our values and our beliefs? What about our marital status? If I'm married, does that make me more like you or less like you? And is there an impact on how that makes us engage with one another? Thinking styles, national origins, our parental status, being a parent, how we parent, if we parent, maybe we're not parents, maybe we were parents. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a niece, I'm an aunt. They're very, very different roles, and I engage with each of those people differently. And each of them see me pretty much in that one facet. My grandson couldn't possibly understand how my brother sees me. Our physical abilities, our gender identity, and our religious beliefs. We've talked about sexual orientation, our military experience, whether or not we're a veteran, gives us access to a space unlike any other, and that is not available to people who aren't veterans. Our educational background, our socioeconomic status, this and so much more lies beneath the surface. So I hope you'll indulge me with a little origin story. When I was about 8 years old, maybe a little younger than I am here, my mother sent me to the liquor store to buy her a pack of cigarettes. You could do that back then with a note from your mom. So I went to the corner store, acquired the cigarettes, and the older white man across the counter asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I was born in Pittsburgh." And he said, No. He said, "What's your nationality?" And I said, "American." And he smiled again and shook his head and he said, "It's okay, never mind." And he sent me home. Well, if you knew me, you would know that I like to get A's. And I knew I did not answer the question correctly. So when I got home, I described the exchange to my mom, and she explained that he was asking me about my race, my ethnicity. And she told me I was Black, Irish, and Jewish. She also told me, now I had lots of Black relatives, and I knew that, but I hadn't thought about it. They were my family. Ironically, I didn't have any Irish relatives, and I'll tell you about that as part of the origin story. So she also cautioned me that when people asked me this question, and when I answered it and told people that I was Black and Jewish and Irish, that it would have an impact on some people. It might even make them not want to be my friend. And even at 8, I was fairly righteous and indignant. And I said, well, then that's just, if they don't accept me for who I am, then they're not going to be my friends. And, she thought, fair enough. My mother was an interracial couple before it was legal, let alone before it was cool. And so she understood acutely the impact of engaging in that space. These gorgeous creatures are my grandmothers. On the right is my Grandma Penny. On the left is my Nana Dot. And my grandmother Penny gave birth to my dad when she was just 15. She was young, she was wild, she had been cast out of her house. And as you can see, she's very fair-skinned. She probably had some Scottish ancestry, her maiden name being McLean. And she had an affair with a tailor in the town where they lived. He was Jewish, and I think he was married. His identity remained a very carefully kept secret. He paid for the birth and she bore my father, and she cared for him as best she could for the first 18 months of his life. And then she was really struggling at 17 and a half with a baby boy. And my Nana lived in the same city, small city, Bangor, Maine. And she had had a boy who died in infancy at 6 months from pneumonia. And she was, gosh darn it. Now you're seeing my whole show. She was unable to have any more children, she and her husband, my grandfather. So she went to Penny and she offered to take my dad. The two women knew of each other before that point, but they weren't close by any stretch of the imagination. And my grandma Penny agreed, but they swore a pact that from that moment forward, they would be sisters. And my dad would grow up knowing each of his mothers, knowing the circumstances of his birth. He visited Grandma Penny in the summers as a boy, and he lived with Nana. And these two women remained steadfast and dedicated to one another for the whole rest of their lives. From them, I learned that family comes in all kinds of packages, that love is more about, that family is more about love than it is about blood, and that loyalty is the only currency worth trading. My grandma Penny grew up, married, and had more children. On the left here is my dad in the background. This is 1963. That's my grandma Penny's second son, my Uncle Joe. This is another of her sons, my Uncle Val. That's me on Uncle Val's lap. And this is my Nana's sister, my Aunt Ray, and her brother-in-law, Uncle Dell, and their daughter, Sylvia. And over here is my mother, red-haired, freckled, green-eyed, holding my baby brother. I love this picture. And I find it interesting, the sort of standoffishness, this sort of outlier position that my mother holds here that may have just been accidental. She was absolutely embraced by my father's family. Her mother, my grandmother Blanche, a devout Irish Catholic, a formidable woman by any standard, was outraged that my mother was seeing a man who came from a Black family and refused to give consent for her to marry my dad at 17 when she became pregnant with me. My mother said she would just forge her signature, which she could, and my grandmother in the end signed. And we were disowned. I grew up not knowing anyone on the Irish side of my family. We were completely rejected. And this is the family I grew up knowing. So up here is my Aunt Sandra, again, my grandmother Penny's daughter, her youngest daughter, Karim, and this is my Uncle Val, again. My grandma Penny ran a foster home throughout her adult life. My mother used to speculate it was because of whatever measure of guilt she may have felt over having to give my dad over to my Nana. So here I am with Karim, you just met her, and my brother, Chuck. Back here is cousin Timothy, who was one of the fosters, and my Uncle Val again. Over the years, she adopted some of the children that she fostered. And my Aunt Sandra, when she turned 18, she adopted Timothy and two others. Terry and James. So at 18, she became an adoptive mother of 3. So we begin to see the impact of, again, our diversity, our similarities, and our differences, that they can also have on our biological sense of self, our psychological sense of self, our cultural sense of self, and our social sense of self. And like so many of the other ways in which our identities overlap and intersect and accumulate, these forces cannot be divorced from one another. My mother, in this photo, my father would die in a car accident about 7 months after this photo was taken. Just 3 weeks before my 3rd birthday, my brother was 17 months old. And a few months later, my mother fled Pittsburgh for Southern California, getting on a train with $100 and a tuna sandwich, and my brother and me. And she never looked back. I would be 18 before she would see her mother again. We would leave then, the only family that I knew. My brother didn't remember these events, these days in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, but I did. So my brother and I grew up with very different cultural understandings of ourselves, very different social understandings of ourselves, and certainly very different psychological understandings of ourselves. And it's created a lifelong rift and very, very complicated relationship between my brother and me. So where do we belong? Where do I belong? Someone who's been told, no, you're not Black. I met a Japanese immigrant and artist. I went to his show, and he asked me, people always ask me. And when I told him I'm Irish, Black, and Jewish, he said, no, you're not. You're white. Isn't that interesting? Here's a person of color who can't see me. Very, very recently, in the last probably 3 months, a white colleague of mine said in a conversation around these issues, said, how did she put it? She said, I know you say you're biracial, but you present white. I'm not sure what that even means. Is my hair not curly enough? Is my skin not brown enough? Am I too what or not enough something else? Clearly not fitting into that colleague's frame of reference for what even a biracial person looks like or sounds like. I always say, think Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse was Black and Jewish, and I wonder if people asked her, and I wonder if they told her if she wasn't who she said she was. Very curiously, and as a quick aside, one question has come up every single time, and I'm going to guess that someone in our audience had it early on, and that is, when I say I'm Irish, Black, and Jewish, the first question is, who's Black? Your mother or your father? Isn't that curious? No one can articulate why they need to know that, but they need to know. It informs something around diversity, some of the ways our similarities and our differences impact our interactions with one another. So as you know, I'm a therapist. I still maintain my credential, although I don't practice anymore. And my bachelor's degree is in human development. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. If you ever took Psych 101, you learned about Abraham Maslow. To my way of thinking, there are two kinds of people in the world. The kind I'd enjoy having a pint of beer with, and the kind I'd think, maybe not. I would love to have a beer with Abraham Maslow and Peggy McIntosh. So Maslow identified what we've come to know as the hierarchy of needs, this pyramid that rests on meeting our physiological needs first and foremost, without having proper food, shelter, clothing, without having air and water, without having a place to feel, to a place to where we know we can survive. We can't grow. We can't grow as humans and reach our full potential without having met these very essential basic needs. And then once they're met, we can begin to think about our safety and our security. How will we be okay? What resources are available to us to maintain those physiological needs, to stay healthy, to enjoy some prosperity? And then once we've met our needs for safety and security, that's when we as humans can begin to enjoy a sense of belonging, a sense of love, of friendship, of intimacy, of family, and a sense of connection. And our intersectionality thrives in this space where we feel a sense of love and belonging. Having been extracted from my family of origin as a young girl and been put into a whole different environment, still and more impoverished than before, and away from the guiding presence and safety and security of my Nana and my Grandma Penny, struggling for food and shelter, it became difficult to belong. And when you struggle to belong, as so many of our LGBTQIA friends and colleagues do, when you struggle to belong, as so many of our BIPOC friends and colleagues do, it's really, really hard to experience esteem in yourself and in the eyes of others, to have mutual respect and esteem for oneself, to have a sense of one's status, recognition, freedom. This is all predicated on these having been met first. And once we have this, and we begin to feel our sense of self and thrive in our personhood, we achieve self-actualization. And here's where we become the most that we can be and reach our full potential as humans, as professionals, as friends, and within our respective circles. So part of intersectionality and taking an intersectional approach then is recognizing that people's lives are multidimensional and complex. And we really should and we need to expect multiple stories, that we're all so much more than one thing, and that we can be so many things contemporaneously and thrive in all of those spaces at once. Not just gender, ethnicity, and class, and then race and nationality and disability, but what about how we look? What about our mental health? What about our political affiliations, our cultures, the kinds of personalities we have? what our educational status is, where are we sited, what is our location, and how does that inform how we're seen and how we see others. So an intersectional lens then requires us to engage in a really reflective process, recognizing the ways in which different social identities, including our own, right, produce these intersecting systems of privilege. Remember privilege, those unearned assets, and oppression, those spaces in which we're locked out, or at least we're made to prove who we are, to work harder to get where we are, and how those systems create different lived experiences within our social context. You'll remember from March of 2021, the Gold Spa in Atlanta, Georgia, where 8 Asian women were massacred by one crazed individual. And it was in the midst of a spike in anti-Asian hate that sprang out of COVID and long buried, simmering, lingering hate for people who are not like us. And when this happened, it was the media largely saw it as a hate crime against the Asian community. And I can tell you, as a non-Asian woman, I saw it as a hate crime against women. It was misogyny at its most heinous and brutal level, the ultimate form of control over women and their bodies and their personhood. So if the question is, was it an Asian hate crime or a misogynistic crime? The answer is yes. Because the experience of an Asian woman is very, very different than the lived experience of an Asian man. And the experience of a woman is very different from that of a man. And it was a crime against humanity. And that's where having a deeper understanding of intersectionality comes into play, because it's all those things, and it hurt on so many levels for so many people and for different reasons. It's unfair, like I said earlier. It's unjust. And frankly, it's just not possible to expect people to check one, to pick one thing to be, one identity to hold, and reject all others. So I'd like to introduce you to a concept we as therapists learn. It's a concept of holding space. And holding space is the practice of compassionately witnessing, accepting, and supporting someone without judgment, while retaining your own boundaries and your own sense of self. I shouldn't have to prove I am who I say I am. Ancestry.com can, but I shouldn't have to. To just hold space and allow other people, fellow humans, our friends and our colleagues, to stand in their own truth and be a witness to it and validate it and to hold that space with them. That is what it really means to be an ally and to understand intersectionality at its core. So I'll take you back to Peggy McIntosh's definition of privilege and the essay you've received, and I hope that you'll read it. And one of the things she talked about having as an unearned asset is this invisible passport that lets you in to certain spaces where others may not have access. And as a bit of homework, it would bring me great comfort to know that you thought for a few minutes today about what's in your passport. Where do you get to go that others don't, without being questioned or judged or wondered about? And how do you engage with people who don't have access to those spaces and to begin to appreciate the multiple facets that we all hold. Thank you so much for your time. I think we have 5 minutes or so for questions or comments if anybody has any. And I will stop this share.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was just really amazing and so informative and also so authentic and so brave of you to tell us your personal history and to share your family and all of the ups and downs that life has for people, you know, as time goes on. If there are any questions, Sarah, should we start seeing if
I
Sherry
haven't seen any pop up, but I do encourage anyone to either raise their hand to speak or submit a question in the chat. We have a few minutes.
I have a question. I've been really intrigued, obviously, about intersectionality, and that's why I wanted to present this program for everyone to learn more about it, but also about, you know, generational traumas, generational effects on families and the dynamics that plays. And I know that you have a background as a therapist. Are you able to speak a little bit more about that and how it works with intersectionality as well?
In such a short time, I'll say that it's real. Generational trauma is a very real thing, as is secondary and vicarious traumas and tertiary trauma. We can't, again, divorce ourselves from our lived experience. And there's all the silent messages that we live in the spaces in which we engage. And it's really important to remember, too, that my lived experience isn't the same as the next biracial person's. And while they might have an experience of trauma that's informing how they engage with the world, it would be very different from my own. And again, to hold space for that and not reject it and say, get over it. Or that didn't happen to you. That was your grandmother, you know.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make there. I'm learning more and more about that. And when I meet new people, or even people that I've known for a long time, I have to be conscious of that and remind myself that of my own biases or my own preconceived notions of how this person should be. So that's a really great reminder. Also, I thought it was very interesting when you said that a colleague of yours had said, oh, I know you're biracial, but you don't present that way or
Right.
something along those lines.
Present white.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, we have so many genes in our body and they're informing in a way, and I'm so sorry to present the way.
And it's a curiosity. Again, when I was young, I had a very powerful role as an ally and an agent for change because I could subvert from within, if you will, right? The Greeks thought I was Greek and the Spaniards thought I was Spanish and the Italians think I'm Italian. And so I could, my privilege, my unearned asset was to be able to float through and within almost any culture and any ethnic group and be unseen. I call it being a chameleon, and that invisibility is my superpower. And then I could shake it up from the inside. Today, that is less valued. So now I think today, in some ways, my experience is that of a poser, that I'm being seen as a poser, as an imposter, a biracial woman, also a dear colleague, referred to me not that long ago in the last year as a white passing person of color.
Wow.
And it stung. It just stung. And I thought, I don't pass for anything. I've never claimed to be just one thing or nothing. So I find myself as I get older, especially now that everybody has died, of belonging everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, that's very, very amazing. Wow. I have a similar story. It's really interesting. I was in New York a long time ago, and I was in a taxi ride, and the driver was talking to me and everything, and then he said, "Where are your parents from?" Because I told him they were originally living in New York for a while. That's where they met. And I said, my mom is from Indonesia and my dad is from Trinidad and Tobago. And he said, "Oh, you're like Tiger Woods." And I said, "Oh, no, I'm not that good at golf. I don't play golf, you know?" And he was like adamant. He was like, no, I meant you're black.
That's not what I mean.
You're black. And I said, "Oh no, I'm not black actually." But you know it. And my cousin who is Chinese, both her parents are from Trinidad, and she actually made a little short documentary called "But You're Not Black," because she gets it so often. Like, both my parents are from Trinidad, and they're like, "Wait, but you're not black." How do you know I'm not black? I could be black, you know?
And as my Nana, I hope this doesn't offend, but my Nana used to say, it doesn't wash out. You know, she was always so concerned that when I married, you know, that everyone knew, because he had seen it happen, right? And then it becomes a case of mama's baby, daddy's maybe, and you're in trouble.
No, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's the best part of being biracial, is wondering what your kid's going to look like.
Yeah, definitely.
And being excited about it. It's like,
Yeah, right. And it's the beauty of genetics, you know. It's we have so many thousands of genes. It's an amazing thing, you know, nature. So we should celebrate it, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. Yeah, and I have biracial family members, and my husband is also biracial and multiracial, and so yeah, it's more fun, you know. I always say the more the merrier. So yeah. Well, thank you so much. Are there any questions, Sarah, or is that
no questions, but a comment. Sherry, you are a true inspiration with an amazing story. Thank you so much. And I agree. And with that, I want to say one more thank you to Sherry so much for presenting. Thank you, Natasha, for pulling this together. Thank you everyone for attending and being here with us today. Again, you'll get your materials. The article that Sherry mentioned will be coming to you as well, along with the PowerPoint, and you'll get your certificate in the next couple of days. I think that's it on my end. So everyone have a great rest of the week, and thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sherry.
Bye.
Bye for now.